All right, hi everybody. Nice to meet you. Thanks, Kevin, for the invite. We really appreciate it when folks all the way up here are interested in what we're working on in Sacramento. I live in Davis, which is about to become a community choice aggregator. So we have a CCA that's about to be set up. So I'm interested in the next talk as well. It sounds like you guys have a great series here, and I'm glad to be part of it. So as Kevin said, I work for the Air Resources Board, which is part of the California Environmental Protection Agency. It actually predates the federal EPA. So we're proud of our leadership role that we've had on air pollution for a long time, since the 60s. And we're going to continue that California leadership now that we're working under the federal Trump administration, which I'm sure many of you are aware, just recently decided to roll back some of the Obama administration's key provisions. So that's upsetting to us, but we're ready to keep pushing forward and continue to lead on these issues. And so let me tell you a little bit about starting with our air quality and climate change goals in California and how they're sort of some of the most ambitious in the world. And then I'll get into the low carbon fuel standard policy, which is the program I run. It's very focused on transportation fuels. Then I'm going to talk about how those fuels are doing in California and the deployment that we've seen really since about 2011 is when the program got started. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the post-2020 timeframe, because we're at this point in California's work on climate change where we're moving from shooting for the reductions in 2020 to moving that yardstick out to 2030 and starting to plan about how we're going to get to an even longer term goal out that far ahead. And then I'll talk about what the rest of the world is doing really briefly on these fuels and policies that are similar to California's LCFS. So let me start with just a little bit more about the ARB. As I said, we are an agency that really helped figure out what smog was, right? And started putting catalytic converters on cars and those types of actions. And that leads to sort of a long legacy that's built primarily around traditional air pollutants, both criteria pollutants, the pollutants that are regulated under the Clean Air Act in the original version of it, and then toxic air pollution, which is has more longer-term health effects and can cause cancer. We've made significant progress on those issues in California, especially with reducing cancer risk from diesel vehicles. I mean, you can see here on the chart, diesel vehicle miles traveled have gone up significantly since 1990, but diesel cancer risk has gone down for a variety of reasons. First, we've taken a lot of the sulfur out of the fuel. We've added particulate filters to trucks and made some real strides there. We've also made reductions in ozone and carbon monoxide and made some progress recently in these areas, the San Joaquin Valley, San Luis Obispo, and Imperial. But unfortunately, oh, sorry, I skipped one here, I think. No, I didn't. Okay. We do still have big problems in the state with traditional air pollutants. So really, the 8-hour ozone standard is a problem in a large part of the state, but especially in Southern California. Down here in the South Coast, the LA area, that's some of the worst air quality in the nation. Particulate matter is a real problem in the Central Valley. And obviously, both of these are long-standing issues that, as I said, we've been working on since the 60s, and we still haven't solved, right? So, but there's a new challenge, and this is really what I'm most focused on, is climate change issues, right? We've been working on the greenhouse gas problem since about 2006, when AB 32, which Kevin mentioned, was signed. It was a piece of pretty landmark legislation that said we're going to return the state back to the 1990 level of greenhouse gas emissions by 2020. And that was a pretty ambitious goal at the time. People said, how are we going to do that? And we've actually gotten pretty close already. We're at around a little over 440 something right now, and we need to get to 431. So we believe we are on track to do that by 2020. And then we set ourselves a new, even more ambitious target of 260 million metric tons in 2030. And the bill that did that was called Senate Bill 32. It was signed last year, and it was signed by, or it was authored by Fran Pavley, who was really one of the leaders in this area. She was responsible for a lot of the great climate legislation that California's had in place. And so she and Governor Brown and others have really been champions of this issue for quite some time, and really allowed our agency to take some leadership role on it internationally. We also have a long-term goal of an 80% reduction in greenhouse gases below 1990 levels by 2050. And that really is going to require a complete transformation of the entire economy to get to something like that. I mean, even the 2030 goal is relatively ambitious, and it's sort of hard for some people to picture what that might look like. So we have a big process underway, which I'll talk about a little bit, called the scoping plan. In my intro, Kevin mentioned I worked on the first version of the scoping plan that was done for AB 32. We're doing another one for SB 32. And so if anybody is really interested in this, I suggest you go to our website, you take a look at the scoping plan document, and it should sort of provide the vision for the state and how we're going to make big reductions across all sources of emissions. This is a little preview of that document. Really, it is going to require changes in the electricity that we use, the vehicles we use, the fuels we use for those vehicles, how we heat and cool our homes, how we treat the carbon stock in our forests and our working lands. And we have to deal pretty critically with short-lived climate pollutants, including methane, black carbon, F-gases. And so we've had a whole separate plan on that as well, which is also available on our website. And then we also want to be sure while we're working on mitigation and reducing greenhouse gases, we're also focused on adaptation and preparing the state for some of the impacts that may come from climate change. So those are sort of the key pillars. And Governor Brown speaks about all these things. The 50% reduction in petroleum from vehicles is the one that I'm most involved with, as I'll get into here in a second. And I think that's the most ambitious too. I mean, that's pretty significant. And so that's the segue here is, the transportation sector is one of the hardest sectors to really find a way to make a change in. But it's a huge part of the problem, both in the conventional pollutants that I was speaking about earlier, NOx and diesel PM, and 40% of the greenhouse gases in the state. So we're not going to solve the greenhouse gas problem without trying to figure out what to do in the transportation sector. So we have a variety of programs that address this sector. There's a program called the Advanced Clean Cars, which has been in the news recently. You may have heard that California is pushing back against the Trump administration on these vehicle standards. That's this Advanced Clean Cars program. It contains both tailpipe efficiency standards for vehicles so that they have to reduce the amount of greenhouse gases they emit for conventional vehicles, and then also a zero-emission vehicle component, right? So promotion of electricity and hydrogen vehicles is a separate part of that Advanced Clean Cars program. So that's one of the first key things that we can do to tackle the transportation problem. The second key thing is reducing demand for vehicle miles traveled through things like smart growth and sustainable cities, right? So the idea that maybe you don't have to just sprawl and sprawl and sprawl the way Los Angeles and other communities have historically done. Maybe you can build more livable, more walkable communities and make it possible for folks to get to work in a dense way and in a way that actually improves their health because they're biking everywhere, and those types of issues are ways that you can make an impact too. And then finally, the one that I work on, I'm going to spend the rest of the time today focused on, is you change the fuels you use in the rest of the vehicles that you're still using. So what do I mean when I say low carbon fuels? I just thought I'd give a couple of examples for folks who don't spend most of their time thinking about this. Let me start with biodiesel. Biodiesel is derived from vegetable oils and tallow. What happens is you start with a vegetable oil, potentially even a used cooking oil from, say, a McDonald's or somewhere like that, and you take it through the process of esterification or transesterification, and you produce biodiesel at the end and a little bit of glycerin as well. So it's so simple you can do it in mason jars, and people do it on YouTube and other things. You can go take a look at it. It's pretty interesting. Renewable diesel is a little more sophisticated. It's the same general feedstocks going in, but coming out is not sort of a fatty acid methyl ester like in biodiesel, but rather it's a straight chain hydrocarbon. So it's something that looks more like conventional diesel and can be used as what we call sort of a drop-in fuel. So it's a fuel that you can use up to 100% of in a conventional diesel engine without any major problems, right? So that's a picture of the renewable diesel down below there. Ethanol is a fuel that most folks have heard of if they've heard of alternative fuels at all. It's used about at a 10% blend in almost every gallon of gasoline you buy in the state. It's primarily derived from corn in the US. It can also be made from things like sugarcane in Brazil. When you make it from corn, you got to take it from starch into a sugar first before you ferment it and make ethanol. And that takes a little bit more energy and is less efficient than doing it from sugarcane. So as you see when I get into some of my greenhouse gas footprinting for all these fuels, that corn ethanol has a slightly higher footprint, or a significantly higher footprint than cane ethanol. So another key fuel that we're helping to drive with the low carbon fuel standard is biomethane. Biomethane is basically natural gas almost, but it's derived from biomaterials, right? It starts from the anaerobic digestion of organic waste in landfills or in, say, dairy digesters, where you've collected a bunch of manure and you put it into an anaerobic environment. Methane comes off, and you can purify that methane to pipeline quality or to a quality that's good enough to be used in a vehicle, and you can use that as a fuel. Finally, electricity. Luckily in California we have, as I said before, a real focus on cleaning up our electric grid as well. So our electricity is extremely clean, and using electricity in vehicles provides fantastic greenhouse gas benefits and also zero traditional criteria pollutants from the tailpipe. So my agency, the Air Resources Board, is extremely focused on electricity and hydrogen. Hydrogen is also, when used in vehicles, a zero tailpipe emission fuel. The hydrogen that's in state and being used today tends to be derived from steam methane reformation of fossil natural gas, but it can also be made from electrolysis. I was chatting with Dr. Lehman today, and he was saying that I guess some of the folks here at this university did some of the first electrolytic hydrogen in the US, which is extremely, that was groundbreaking in the 80s, and that was, what led to the ability for Toyota and others to sell fuel cell vehicles that are available commercially today. And so when you derive hydrogen from electrolysis using renewable sources of power, it's an extremely clean fuel, and could be used in the future to great effect. It's still much smaller than all these other fuels today, as you'll see in my charts coming up here. So let me talk a little bit about the policy that I work on all the time, which is the low carbon fuel standard. It has a couple of goals. The first and most important is really to reduce greenhouse gases. And the way we talk about greenhouse gases in this program is we use the term carbon intensity. What that means is the amount of greenhouse gases per unit of energy of the fuel. And I'll describe that in more detail in a second here. But that's not the only goal, and we've been explicit that this policy isn't just about the greenhouse gas footprint of the fuel. It's also about innovation and transformation and diversity of the fuels that we do use in state. And so it's about reducing petroleum dependency and building the infrastructure and the technical know-how to make the fuels of the future. So the program was sort of passed by our board in 2009, and then was challenged immediately by oil companies, Midwestern ethanol companies, and others in various court challenges. They actually forced us to address some procedural issues and re-adopt the program in 2015. The program did still run from 2011 to 2015, but as I'll show you, we weren't able to do it at the full level of stringency that we originally wanted to. So the program is fuel neutral. It promotes all these low carbon fuels based on this carbon intensity scoring, and it does not attempt to pick winners. But it does say we need to really be making progress in fuels that are non-petroleum derived. I mean, we are allowing some credits for actions within the petroleum supply chain, but primarily we are focused on these alternatives to petroleum and petroleum reduction. It's flexible in that you can choose to innovate and reduce the carbon intensity of the fuel used yourself, or you can buy low carbon fuel from others and blend it into your final product, or you can use a tradable credit system that I'll talk about more in detail here in a second. And this is pretty standard now. I mean, almost all of our policies that we have at ARB have some form of tradable credits. The most extreme of that being the cap and trade program, which some people may have read some press articles about. But all of the advanced clean car policies I just mentioned have tradable credits. Almost every large environmental policy has some sort of credit trading flexibility built into it now. So the scope is really transportation fuels as distinct from fuels used in stationary applications. The reason that we focused on that is that we believe that there are some bigger challenges there, and it's a difficult nut to crack. As I said, it's a large portion of all these emissions. And so we are focused on transportation fuels used in motor vehicles, but that does include off-road equipment like forklifts. And I was just driving up here, a beautiful drive, by the way, on the 101. But I saw a bunch of landslides with everybody and their heavy earth movers out there. And Caltrans and others now are buying a significant portion of renewable diesel as well to run those machines. So that's pretty exciting in my mind. And it covers the fuels that I mentioned previously, and also any other liquid or non-liquid fuel for on-road transport. So we've tried to be pretty inclusive with this program, and it tends to touch on almost everything that is in a vehicle. So the way it works, again, is based on this idea of carbon intensity. And it's expressed in terms of grams of carbon dioxide equivalent per megajoule of fuel energy. So I don't know if all of you are familiar with the idea of carbon dioxide equivalent. I mean, carbon dioxide is the most important greenhouse gas, right? It's the one that people usually think about. But there are plenty of other greenhouse gases that do create a portion of the overall climate change effects. And so what this program does is it converts all those other gases like methane into a carbon dioxide equivalent, expresses that on a life cycle basis across each of these fuels in grams of carbon dioxide equivalent per megajoule of finished fuel energy. And the way we do that is unfortunately not that simple. So we have 3 relatively complex models that we use to do this work. The first is called CA-GREET. It's built on the Argonne National Lab GREET. What that is a system that was built up by this national lab to evaluate a whole bunch of fuels, but mostly the direct effects of those fuels, right? So the impacts of actually growing the crops, moving the crops to the production facility, running the production facility, taking it to California, and then burning it in the vehicle. So we call that sort of direct life cycle analysis, if you will. Another version of life cycle analysis is called consequential life cycle analysis, which thinks about, all right, when I do all those direct actions, do I change any other markets or impact any other systems globally? And so we have the GTAP model, which the University of Purdue helped us set up to run in this way, to evaluate the indirect effect of when more corn is grown to make ethanol. Somewhere else, someone probably puts additional land into production to grow more food crops. So there's an indirect impact of making some of the crops that you're currently using to make food into the fuel supply chain. Somewhere someone brings additional land into production. Because of that, that GTAP model helps us evaluate that part of it. The final model is what we call OpG, and that's focused on the sort of oil production side of things, and that was developed in conjunction with Stanford University. So, unfortunately, it takes these 3 pretty complicated models all working in conjunction to give you a carbon intensity score across the life cycle of all these fuels together. But, I mean, a lot of material is available on our website about this. I don't know if we have any people who are strongly interested in life cycle modeling in the class, but I think that these 3 are pretty good primers, actually. If you want to learn about these sort of things, I encourage you to go take a look at those. So, as I said, every fuel gets a carbon intensity score in the system. Some are high and some are low, right? And every year we have a targeted carbon intensity. That's what this line represents. If your fuel has a score that's higher than the targeted carbon intensity, it's going to generate deficits in the program. And if you have a score that's better than the line, you generate credits. So all the conventional fuels, like gasoline and diesel, are above the line. They generate deficits. The low carbon fuels are below the line. They generate credits. And really what the requirement is that the fossil fuel providers have to go out and find enough credits to match their deficits. You can see the line was a little flat in 13 through 15. That was a result of that lawsuit that I mentioned. So it forced us to freeze the target while we addressed some procedural issues. And as a result, we didn't get as much emission reductions as we could have in those years. But we did make significant progress. That's shown in this green line. We've had more than a 2% carbon intensity decline by 2015. The 2016 numbers are just coming out. It's almost at 3%. So we're staying below our targeted carbon intensity, but we have very steep sort of curve out to 2020, where we want to achieve a 10% reduction in that time frame. And the program will continue post-2020, as I'll get into, but we haven't set the stringency for those out years yet. So let me just pause there and take a quick little reaction from the audience. Does everyone generally understand what I'm talking about? Have I missed anything, or does anybody have any quick questions?
Is that green line actual fuel used or credits?
It's essentially the credits translated to a carbon intensity. Yeah, because
if people are banking credits, are they represented in that green line? Or
they are. They are. So that, there's been overcompliance, as I'll get into, and that creates a credit bank, and that's reflected in this line.
I ran a lot of models about 10 years ago with GREET, so that's very familiar to me. And I was wondering if you have any reaction to analysis by Pimentel and Patzek on biodiesel and bioethanol. I don't know if you've read their papers and what they've discussed as far as carbon depletion.
Yeah.
In soils.
So they're essentially sort of proposing a separate framework, right, beyond the current life cycle accounting approach, right? And I don't have strong opinions about that framework. I'm more of a policy guy. I will have to say that I think some of that work may have been funded by the petroleum industry. So, I mean, I'm not sure I find it super credible. But anyway, and, we always are trying to learn new things and stay abreast of the science. But, in general, we want to be sure we're doing that in a way that's fair and is neutral. And so, yeah.
Do you think you can do that?
That's a very steep curve, right? It's challenging. Yeah. I should stretch out the graph more so it doesn't look so steep. But, it's, yes, right.
It's 10%, it's not 50%.
Yeah. It's a serious goal, right? It's dramatic transformation. Yeah. Right. Yeah, it is, absolutely. And we're not naive about that. There you go. That would be true. Yeah, and it doesn't have to happen. Yeah, I mean, I'll get into more what that looks like in a second here. But, it's significant additional use of all those fuels I just talked about on the prior slide. Yeah. So if your carbon intensity score for your fuel is better than the target, what you get is the delta between where your score is and the target for that year.
So a manufacturer comes in, rolls out these numbers and says, this is the combination of fuel sources we're using.
Yeah.
We generate these credits. As a consequence, we can burn deficit fuels?
Yes, that's right. So you can match your deficit fuels with your credit-generating fuels, and as long as you're below the target for the year, you're good. Yeah.
Collectively, we're still lowering our overall CI.
That's right. Yeah.
If you don't achieve the target, is there a pressure relief valve built into the market?
Yeah.
The prices might.
There is. There's a soft price cap built in, and maybe I should have kept going with my slides. I was checking for basic understanding. You guys are asking LCFS 200 level stuff, which is great. But there is a soft price relief valve at $200 a ton. Basically, what it does is it allows borrowing to occur at that price.
The carbon intensity, is that, I'm assuming that's to the wheels, so it includes the efficiency of the vehicle.
It is.
That's an average vehicle efficiency across the whole
Yes.
stock?
Yep, that's right. And that is, I think that's an area that is not super robust in all of this life cycle accounting. We spend a ton of time on the fuel production technology, and we don't evaluate or change the vehicle efficiency on a very frequent basis. And that's partially because we have separate rules pushing vehicle efficiency. But that is a fair point, yeah.
Is there any one fuel that's generating most credits?
Yeah, I definitely should have kept going because I have almost all these questions answered. But it used to be more ethanol, where ethanol is now about 40-something% of the credits. Biodiesel and renewable diesel are each about 20, and then the rest is made up for electricity, renewable natural gas, tiny amount of hydrogen now, as I'll show you. But, yeah.
Just to follow up on Jerome's question for a second. So the carbon intensity, it has to do with, I guess what I'm learning is in terms of vehicle miles traveled. And so for instance, hydrogen, right? The BTU content might be, compared to a BTU content of another fuel,
Right.
say biodiesel.
But the vehicles are 3 times as efficient. Yeah.
That might get
Yeah.
50 miles or 60 miles per
Right.
kilogram, and the other one's getting 30 miles
Yeah.
per gallon, which, per
Yeah, we have ratios that are based on vehicle comparisons between vehicle efficiency. We call it the EER factor, the energy equivalence factor. It corrects for that, essentially. But it does, I mean, it gives that full credit to the hydrogen vehicle because it's so efficient. And that's different from some other programs globally. So I think that's an important part of this California program. Yeah.
How are these being assigned to public transit agencies and fleet vehicle conversions?
Yeah. Yeah, so we're,
Exceptions for being like a public utility?
no, in fact, the public transit agencies are some of the largest, active supporters of this program in Sacramento. And they work through CalSTART and other organizations. And the reason that they are supportive is they do receive the credits directly for the CNG buses they run, especially if they're running renewable natural gas. Any electric buses or hydrogen buses that they have, they receive the credits directly. They monetize them, they sell them, they make money off of it. And they are using this program to help buy the next round of buses. So they are also getting credits for their light rail and other things in the system as well. But they are receiving real monetary value from it. And I think they're pretty supportive. So, you want me to keep going here? I swear I got all the answers in here somewhere. These are the actual, These are the actual carbon intensity targets for each year. And I'm going to walk through some example carbon intensities for you guys. So, I mean, just know that they're in the 90s, declining down to the 80s or the low 90s. And that there's a pool for gasoline and its substitutes, and there's a pool for diesel and its substitutes. And the reason those two things are kept separate is you can kind of tell from the application if the vehicle and fuel combination is more likely to displace diesel or gasoline, and it's slightly more carbon intensive to make diesel than gasoline. So you just have two standards going on in the same system. But the percentage carbon intensity decline relative to 2010 baseline is the same across both fuel pools. I'm having trouble with the. Okay, so let me just go through a few examples. And these are really examples because our system tends to assign individual producers their own score. So like every ethanol plant that supplies to California now has its own score pretty much. But let me start with carbob. Carbob is the fossil component of the gallon of finished gasoline that you use in your car. As I said, ethanol tends to make up about 10% of that, almost statewide. The ethanol, I'll get into it in a second, but let's focus on the fossil side of it, right? The fossil side starts at the oil well, where the oil is pulled out of the ground. That produces about 12 grams per megajoule. It's moved to the refinery, which gives you an extra gram. The refinery emits 13 grams per megajoule. It's transported to the retail station, and then it's combusted in the vehicle. And that's the tailpipe portion of the carbob life cycle is the largest, right? So that's different from the ethanol portion of the gallon. Ethanol, you have agricultural emissions upstream at the field, including the embedded emissions in fertilizer and other things like that. Plus you have this indirect, or the land use change issue that I mentioned previously, right, where as you bring additional area of land into production, you potentially produce other folks who go out there and they are going to grow more crops somewhere else. So, or even maybe on the site that someone else right next to them was previously using. So that land use change, disrupting that land, if it has biomass on it today and produces CO2 emissions, disturbing the CO2 in the soil or from the soil, you get land use change number as well, right? And so that's all upstream of the fuel producer and well upstream of the vehicle, right? But those are significant contributors to the life cycle of ethanol. Then the same thing, you transport it to the biorefinery. The biorefinery gets some credit for the co-product it produces. The biggest one of that is distiller's grains. So when you distill ethanol, you end up with a product that can be used as an animal feed. Those animals would have had to eat something. Maybe they would have eaten corn in the past. So that co-product credit is assigned, which improves your score. And then you move that fuel, again, to the vehicles. But at the tailpipe, we give them a biogenic emissions offset. So because the plant is grown from recent carbon taken out of the atmosphere and then emitted back into the atmosphere when it's combusted in the vehicle, that part is essentially netted out. So you end up with scores in the 70s and low 80s for most ethanols right now. Yep.
Does the land use change model, does that assume that land use change happens in the country of origin?
No, it's global. And that is one of the more controversial parts of it, because in the U.S. you actually haven't seen very much land use change recently, but other parts of the world you have. So that's modeling all of that correctly is extremely challenging. It's the most controversial part of this program by far. Many papers have been written about it. You could probably write another dissertation about it if you wanted to at this point, but we are in the place where we have to put something forward, and we've assigned land use numbers that have changed once over time. Most of them have gone down, but our numbers are still some of the highest in the world when you compare them to, say, what's used in the US EPA system, or as I'll get into, Oregon also has an LCFS now. They've chosen lower values for corn ethanol than we have. So Europe has published higher values for biodiesel, but has not fully incorporated those in their system, as I'll get into. So we still believe that we're providing the biggest incentive to move away from crop-based biofuels of most systems in the world right now. So a biofuel that is not necessarily directly crop-derived is used cooking oil. As I said, you go around to every McDonald's and you take their oil from them, and that takes some emissions. You filter that oil and potentially heat it up a little bit to drive off some of the contaminants. You transport it to a biorefinery, and you make biodiesel out of it, and then you move it to the cars and trucks. That gives you pretty low scores, in the 20s in this example. But you'll see there's a range for all these.
Couldn't that oil be used for some other purpose?
Yeah, potentially, right? And the question is, how much of the resource is new, right, or incented by this system, and how much was already being collected and used for some other purpose. And then it's also sort of what backfills that other purpose, right? I mean, let's say it's being used for something frivolous, I don't know what, makeup or something, right, to be unfair. And then people stop using it for that, right? And they just stop using that product. That's one potential outcome. Another potential outcome is palm oil or something that's potentially pretty environmental damaging comes in and backfills that marketplace. And so that's more of these indirect effects, which are challenging to fully model, but important, right? And we definitely get questions about that, like how substitutable are these oils? Are people doing more used cooking oil collection? Those are challenging things to monitor globally, but there are definitely still parts of the world that don't do great used cooking oil collection. And so if they could do more of that, that would be tapping what is pretty much a waste resource right now. So anyway, I mean, another example is, yeah, sorry.
I know these values are just illustrative, but is there a reason that transportation costs are different across different fuels?
Yeah, essentially because in some cases it's more disaggregated, and so it takes more energy to get them all into one place for the final processing, right? And used cooking oil, it tends to be, I guess it has about 2 grams for the transport part of it, plus 1 up here, right? Ethanol had 3, and oil had only 1 in that same step, and that's because oil is pretty dense, energy dense when it comes out of the ground, right? And you don't have to go that many places to get it. A bunch of it comes out in one place, right? So, yeah, it goes in pipelines. It's moved efficiently, right? Big tankers, very efficient across the water, right? Trucks driving around and picking up oil from every restaurant, not as efficient as that. So let me do electricity real quick. As I said, the electric mix in California is very clean. And this is even a 2010 version of that mix. It's gotten dramatically cleaner since 2010. We need to update that portion of the models for sure. But that's, the upstream portion of it's 10 grams. There's some losses as it's transported. Probably shouldn't show a truck there. That would be the wires and everything that as it goes to maybe that's the fuel going to the facility, sorry. So if that's the natural gas, maybe. Then it's moved to California charging stations and used in an electric vehicle where, as I said, it has 0 tailpipe emissions, and then also that efficiency adjustment that we talked about, right, where you are taking account of the fact that the powertrain efficiency is much better than a conventional spark ignition engine. So that comparison is about a 3x sort of improvement and takes a lot off the score. So one more example before I show you the full range. This is the full range. But landfill gas, as I said, you're starting with mostly landfills for biomethane right now, and there's methane collected at the landfill and other gases, including CO2 and carbon monoxide in that landfill gas. You upgrade it and you clean it up to pipeline quality. That produces a significant amount of emissions. You move the gas to the fueling station in California, and then you have an efficiency penalty assigned to some larger CNG trucks, which are less efficient than diesel trucks. There's that avoided flare credit because most of that biogas is required to be flared right now. Almost none of it is emitted as methane, which would be even worse for the climate. Most of it is, by regulation, required to be flared. So the alternate fate is that the biogas would have been flared, and so that part of it, like the tailpipe combustion in the vehicle, is basically canceled out because of that alternate fate. Does that make sense?
Do you have any leakage while it's being transported?
Yeah, and that's an important area of research right now. EDF, Environmental Defense Fund, has just funded this huge study of sort of the overall methane supply chain in the U.S., and every part of it is leaky, and the amount of leaks is the part that's the most under contention. And there is leakage in these models that is adjusted every time we do an update. Someone has a new number for each part of the methane supply chain. And we have fossil gas in the system as well still. CNG from fossil-derived natural gas still benefits slightly from this program. That's really where the controversy is maybe that fuel is actually slightly net emitting if the leakage is really high versus net reducing as we have it today. But when you get into the biogases, we think it's pretty safe to say that they are net reducing an improvement over fossil substitute. But again, it's sort of how much, right? And the leakage is a big driver because methane is such a strong climate change gas. So, you really have to be careful about that part of it, yeah.
Do cities receive any funding from the state to start the recycling of the waste?
Yeah, there are separate programs that do help. The Energy Commission, other programs do grants to have folks in states set up biogas. There's also been feed-in tariffs and other things that have helped wastewater and landfills do some biogas projects in the past, but there's not really been a ton in California for transportation. A lot of it has been out of state, unfortunately, so far. We're really trying to focus on that more. Yeah.
Are there any of these biogas projects that are in California?
Yeah, there are two, and I'll show you a map in a second. Yeah, the waste management at the Altamont landfill has one, and the other one is Clean World. No, there's not pipeline injecting. There's direct fueling of trucks on site there. So you're right. The problem really is the pipeline injection. That's the most challenging part of it right now. There's a law, AB 1900, that set sort of the requirements for pipeline injection or a process to develop those standards. And both the Air Resources Board, who I work for, and the Public Utilities Commission applied standards to how clean that gas had to be when it was injected. They made it pretty clean. Made it relatively hard to do those projects compared to outside of California. So, I'm not really supposed to say whether I think about that beyond that there's not as many in-state projects as I would like for my program because I would certainly like to see more of that fuel be used as a vehicle fuel. But that's a barrier right now. And you can have folks tell you about that barrier. You can have people tell you about how CEQA is a barrier to some of those projects. On the dairy, manure, methane stuff, you have people tell you about local air quality issues previously when they're trying to use it to make electricity. We're trying to solve that problem by saying, okay, don't make electricity. Instead, try and get it into the pipeline, use it as a transportation fuel. And they say, well, that's hard because of these injection standards. So, California is a complicated place to do business, but we're committed to trying to address that issue. And that, as I mentioned, has been a focus recently in Sacramento with this idea of short-lived climate pollutants, right? Like, we know methane, short-lived in the atmosphere, but has a big effect. If we can get it out of the atmosphere, it's going to immediately help. So let's try and solve some of that. And part of that is better using the biogas resource that's in state. So anyway, that was a bit of an aside, but there's a range across all these fuels, right? Big ranges in some cases. Bio-CNG is the largest. This is the dairy dot out here. Because dairies are not required to control methane right now, when they have their manure collected into lagoons that have some anaerobic conditions going on, they have a lot of methane that comes off. And if you can control that, you get the full benefit of reducing that methane, which at the GWP of methane provides a huge score, or a good score in the system, a low negative score. But you can see that for the conventional ethanols, each of these dots represents one pathway or one applicant in the system coming in and saying, this is what my fuel looks like. Do you guys agree? We say yes, and we give them this dot, right? And so ethanol, we have the largest number of pathways. As I said, they're clustered in the 70s and 80s for corn-derived stuff, but they can get down very low. And some of that is the cellulosic stuff, and some of that is waste-derived ethanol from waste wine and other things like that. So renewable diesel tends to be slightly higher than biodiesel, and you can see that both for biodiesel and renewable diesel, we have some people reporting at almost a fossil number, and I can get into more detail about that if you folks want to, but both of these things are good. In general, they tend to be pretty good, in the 20s to 30s, around that range. So they've driven a lot of compliance in the system so far, as I'll show. The only other thing I would say is we've had a bunch of pathways on hydrogen so far, but very small amount of fuel delivered, unfortunately, but we're starting to get more activity there, as I'll show you in a second. And only one dot for electricity right now, which is the California grid mix. We want to get more of pathways centered on renewable power into electricity.
Why not distinguish between different utilities,
Yeah. So originally, it was partially due to legal concerns, right? Because we have great data on the California utilities and poor data on other utilities outside of California. So folks made the argument, oh, well, if you differentiate strongly within utility service territories in California, just for the EVs, or especially if you do it for the ethanol plants in state, that gives them a big advantage. Is that fair to their out-of-state competitors? And we've been sued on so many issues. We were concerned about that one. Yeah, I think we were going to, basically, because we think that California's grid mix is getting so clean, across all utilities because of the RPS program. We need to start recognizing that more clearly. And
a revenue stream for a utility.
it is, yeah. So folks asked about compliance flexibility. There is credit trading, as I talked about, and those credits are fungible across both pools. So even if you make a fuel that is used in the diesel market or the diesel substitutes, you can use it to match against your gasoline sales. They don't expire, so they can be banked in perpetuity. And there is this soft price cap, and it's a little tricky. It's called the credit clearance market. It's a two-step thing. The first step is you're trying to clear any remaining credits in the system, and so there's a forced market at the end of it on top of the normal credit trading market, where anybody who still has credits can come in and match anyone who's short and basically command a premium up to 200 for that credit. And then after they've gone through that episode and everyone is still aware that there's still a shortage beyond that, they can push that shortage into the future. So it functions a little bit like a name and shame thing, because you're forced to declare, yeah, I have deficits still. Sorry, I didn't meet my obligation. Does anyone still have credits they want to sell me? We do that first, and then if they don't solve their problem through that, they can push that forward, but then the obligation grows over time with an interest penalty. So borrowing only occurs at high credit prices in this system, and it hasn't occurred yet because that first step has solved everyone's problems so far. Everyone's always been in compliance except for one entity, which just forgot, right? Whoops, sorry, I forgot that I was supposed to do this. And so they had to go out and buy from this formal market, and they ended up paying above the price they could have got it for in the open market from others. So, there's a little penalty for that, and there's a much bigger penalty if, you don't even go through this exercise. But
That might be much more of a problem in 3 or 4 years.
oh yeah, okay. I'm glad you share our optimism, but that's the oil company's perspective right now, is that this is going to be extremely challenging to meet it in the out years. We disagree, but we also feel that some of them, because we can see everyone's credit balance in the system. Some of them are prepared, some of them aren't, right? This mechanism identifies those that didn't get ready and didn't work hard to get in compliance, and they will be on our website pointed out, as to who didn't do it fast enough. So I don't know. I don't want to put too strong of an emphasis on that, but that's how the system works right now. So, and they can borrow, right? If they can't get into compliance, they can borrow up to 5 years. And then they can make an investment that can produce a low carbon fuel to get them into compliance, right? So this is how the credit price has gone so far. And again, you can see the effect of the lawsuit, right? Prices went up into the 80s. People were thinking, okay, that's a pretty strong carbon price. That's enough to make some investments on. Then the lawsuits came, froze the targets, prices fell into the 20s, stayed there until we addressed the court's issues. Prices went back up into above the 120 for a little while. Then people thought maybe there was some political chance that there would be a deal done to reduce the stringency of the LCFS. That didn't happen. SB 32 was signed. Prices have been near 100. And then recently, another lawsuit issue has come up. But anyway, so far, the most sustained high price period has been most of 2016, basically. And we did see a lot of delivery of low carbon fuel in 2016. But I think the real critical thing is how much money these things are worth right now, right? I mean, you have 7.8 million credits in sort of that annual period, Q4 2015 to Q3 2016. At about $95 a credit during that period, that's $741 million. And in December 2016 alone, 94 million changed hands in the system. I mean, you can see that that December peak was the highest volume we saw. But this is enough to actually motivate some changes in behavior from some of these companies, we think. And I mean, it's another challenge is that the regulators now set up this new financial market and has to pay attention to it and make sure it's functioning well, and has the obligation, to police it as well. So that's a part of this system that, we've really tried to put more emphasis on recently.
Is that an indicator of how much is being banked? 100 million traded and 700 generated?
I'll show you in a second. It's not. No, the 700, the amount that's changed hands is just the amount that was traded, like across parties. It's not how much was created. This number is an indication of how liquid the market is, sort of, or how much people are willing to exchange these things, which is sort of important to be sure that the prices you're seeing are accurate or do actually represent people's marginal abatement costs across a lot of actors. So they're relatively liquid. There's about a trade almost every day now, and the trades have been larger. So people are moving them back and forth, and hopefully that means that everyone is contributing their thoughts on the value of these credits in the system at the same time, which should be an indication of what they should really go for. But again, there's a smaller, it's not a huge market, right? There's a few really large oil companies that need to buy a bunch of these things, and then 100 or so alternative fuel suppliers. And the alternative fuel suppliers have different perspectives on the market, but a lot of the oil companies have maybe more similar perspectives. So.
Have speculators shown up?
Not so much yet, and that was somewhat intentional. They're excluded unless you have a natural position in the market right now. Like you have to actually deliver fuel to California to be part of this system, and that's different from some of our other markets. Like you don't have to have a natural position to participate in the cap and trade program. You can be a speculator. You can be a financial entity. I believe RPS, you can also, the Renewable Portfolio Standard, which has tradable credits, you can also just buy those if you want to. So in the LCFS, you actually have to be at least working in the fuels market somehow. But that's not a very high bar for some banks. Many banks are already sort of involved in the fuels market, but it's a relatively specialized thing. We don't believe that there's people out there purely speculating at this point. We think there's some legitimate hedging going on where people are actually trying to manage their risk forward, and there are some people who are willing to be a market maker for that activity. But that's different than people just purely trying to bet if it's going to go up or down. So.
It's not quite enough money to get an investment bank.
Yeah, that's true. This is still small compared to them, right? But it's large enough that it's noticeable to the fuel companies now. So with respect to how many credits and deficits have been made, that's this chart. In every quarter, we've seen more credits than deficits. And that means that this green line, the credit bank, has been growing over time. And I think, as far as, is this super challenging? You'll know it's challenging when it starts to curve down, right? When you start drawing the bank back down, that's when we know things are really biting. When prices go high, we'll also know that things are really biting. Prices are going down right now, so I don't know what that means. It could mean people are very short run focused because we're having more legal questions. But when prices shoot up and this bank starts being drawn down, then I'll believe that there is an absolute shortage in the system. And there's lots of ways to deal with that. The one way is to just raise that credit price cap, and really push people and say, look, go out there and do this. That's what we're serious about. And you've seen that in the RPS. Same issue, right? People said, you're never going to get to 33% renewable power. Not going to happen, right? The regulators disagreed. They moved the targets a little bit, but generally they stuck to their guns. Every utility is now on track to get there. Contrast that with the ZEV rule, right? The zero emission vehicle rule, which is another rule the ARB has run. Set a very ambitious target, got close to it, people got nervous, said it's not going to happen. They backed off. There was a documentary about it called Who Killed the Electric Car, right? I don't want to be in the next documentary. So I want to be more like the RPS model and less like the ZEV model. Even the ZEV program is working now, right? They slowed down for a little bit, but now you're seeing these vehicles come to market. So the real thing is consistency and keeping these programs in place, and eventually they work. And so even relaxing the target a little bit one way or the other, it's not the end of the world, but I'm not saying we would do that rather than increase the price cap or do something else that could be done to promote the actual new capacity development of these fuels, which is what we're looking for. So someone asked the question about what have we actually seen, what fuels have come to market. That's what this chart is. Basically, the orange bar is ethanol, and then this is all in sort of energy equivalent units, so you can think of it kind of like gallons, but the non-liquid fuels are converted to gallons, basically. So ethanol has been 10% of the gasoline pool since the beginning of this program. Hasn't been any increase in volume, or a very minor increase in E85 maybe. Volume has changed a little bit because total gasoline demand has changed year on year, but there's not been a dramatic penetration of new ethanol as a result of this program. Different types of ethanol have come, but the total volume of ethanol used in California has not changed very much because of the LCFS. What we have seen is growth in the liquid diesel substitutes, biodiesel and renewable diesel shown in light blue and orange, right? And fossil natural gas, shown in the darker blue, has transformed and turned into about half biogas now. And you can just begin to see electricity in this light green bar. I don't know if this thing works. Yeah, you can. Right here. That's electricity. That's the energy used, electric energy used in transportation. Again, energy units, so it doesn't account for that vehicle efficiency benefit yet. You have a low amount of energy, partially because the vehicles are so efficient, but it's small in comparison to the energy used from all these other fuels so far. Hydrogen, you can't see it on the chart. Sorry, it's not there yet. I hope it will be sometime soon. This is the same set of fuels, only shown from the credit generation perspective. And you can think of that sort of as the greenhouse gas benefit of the fuels to some extent. Ethanol has improved its credit generation ability because we've gotten lower carbon ethanol over time. Plus, there's an adjustment to the score in there. So that's part of that. But basically, ethanol has gotten cleaner in California, and you can see that. The carbon intensity curve has gone down for ethanol. So some of that is we've gotten the cleaner stuff that was already existing, but we also have many examples of facilities actually changing their processes to be more efficient. Some of that is like they're using biogas on site as a process fuel. They're just basically improving their efficiency of their process over time through just better heat management and things like that. But we've talked to individual facilities about individual projects they've done. They say we're doing it because of the low carbon fuel standard. So that's nice, and I think you can see that from especially the California facilities, as I'll get into in a second. Electricity, which is in this like darker green, gray here, you can see it on this chart, right? It's much bigger because the credit given for the fuel accounts for the vehicle efficiency and the amount of petroleum displaced, right, or the gasoline displaced. So you get much more credit for the same amount of fuel energy for electricity. But biodiesel and renewable diesel are now more than half, they're much larger than they used to be. And those plus fossil natural gas and renewable natural gas are more than half of the credits now, I think. So we're shifting, ethanol just used to really dominate in the early years, right, because there was already a lot of it being used. But as the volume growth has occurred and as the decarbonization of the other fuels has occurred. It's more mixed now. It's more of a diverse portfolio of low carbon fuels in the state. And the fuel producers are spread pretty well throughout the state. They're the larger dots here. All the red is the ethanol facilities. And of course, we do have a lot of imported fuel as well, but I wanted to focus on where the producers are in state. Red is ethanol. Yellow is biodiesel. This is renewable diesel, this orange. And then everything that's green is electricity stations and major electric producers like the Tesla folks get credit for all their supercharger stations. ChargePoint gets credit for all their public charging stations. The utilities get the credit for the residential charging of the EVs. But you guys have some charging stations up here, I think, maybe a few, right? And then the blue is the renewable natural gas. So there are two. This is the Altamont landfill waste management runs. This is Clean World. It's a food waste digester, I think. And then these purple dots are the CNG stations and LNG stations throughout the state. So, I mean, we do have a pretty good low-carbon fuel infrastructure. There is one hydrogen dot somewhere on there. It might be hidden. But that is the AC Transit folks are in the system. The rest of the hydrogen community has not fully gotten in yet. We're actively trying to push them to get more engaged.
What is the difference between renewable diesel and biodiesel?
They start from the same feedstock, but they end up with different molecules. So biodiesel is fatty acid methyl esters, which cannot be used at like a B100 level in most diesel engines without a little bit of performance issues and maintenance issues. So renewable diesel looks like a hydrocarbon, and it is a drop-in fuel,
It's like
right?
12 carbon.
Yes, yeah.
It's
Straight
chemically
chain.
Chemically
Yeah.
identical to diesel.
Yes, that's right. Chemically identical to one component of petroleum diesel, the cleaner component for the most part, right? The stuff that burns pretty well. So it's a synthetic diesel. It can be blended with other carb diesels to produce a pretty clean fuel that has good criteria pollutant performance. So we like it for that reason as well. You have PM reductions and NOx reductions from renewable diesel. And so it's a good fuel. And it behaves in the engine very similar to conventional diesel, which is the main advantage, right? You can mix it at the refinery. It can go anywhere in the state, not have problems. So biodiesel has more, cold point performance issues too. When you take it up to higher elevations, you have to make sure that you have the right type of biodiesel. So renewable diesel, less so.
So renewable diesel is basically a direct substitute for petroleum diesel.
Yeah. So I tried to also list who's getting the credits here. These are the most of the parties, and you can see there are some of those transit agencies on there. So I did just want to explain a little bit more about the EV and the hydrogen side of it, because my slides make it look like there's not that much excitement going on in the EV and the hydrogen space. I don't think that's true. It's just that we have such a macro view in the LCFS. We're looking at all the fuel used in the state, which is a large amount of energy, and it's changing slowly, right? But the development in the vehicle side is fantastic on the EVs, right? You've had just dramatic growth in PEV sales over time, and you can see that red is China, green is Western Europe. They're the biggest drivers, but California is the third largest. California is the light pink at the bottom, plus the other 177 states. Those are other states that have adopted our zero-emission vehicle rule, and most of that is California. So we are definitely contributing above and beyond our population share by far, and so we're a pretty significant part of the global EV picture. And I'm sorry, the vehicles picture is exciting because there's starting to be dramatic, additional vehicles available across different size categories. You have also dramatic price declines in battery technology. So you have Tesla, especially with the Model 3. I'm sure most of you guys might have heard something about that. They're out there saying they're going to sell that for in the $30,000 range, and it's going to have over 200-mile range. That car should be good for most people most of the time, right? And they're not the only ones, right? The Bolt is out there today. Those are the cars that can be real transformational. Plus, the larger plug-in hybrids are starting to make an appearance, right? Like the Pacifica, which is supposed to be to California soon. I actually want to buy one, but it's not here yet. It's taking forever. The Outlander is supposed to come next year. They've delayed that a couple times. But those are selling in Europe. So the fact that the larger vehicles are beginning to make some penetration is exciting because most of the people originally thought the plug-ins would have a hard time in the larger passenger vehicle space, and they thought that would be more of a role for hydrogen. Now they're saying that more about the heavy-duty vehicles. But the fact that they've gotten some of the SUV, minivan-sized vehicles out there already this fast is really impressive. So you're going to have, yeah. So this one, the Pacifica, this is 30-something, right? And I don't know what the Outlander is off the top of my head, but that's enough for most people to drive, a very large portion of their total VMT on, as the Volt has sort of shown. Like in our Advanced Clean Cars package, we just put that out. It shows that people get almost the same amount of eVMT out of the Volt as they do out of the Leaf, right? The Leaf is 100% electric. The Volt, is a plug-in hybrid. People use the Volt like a pure electric for almost all their trips, right? Because most people don't drive more than 40 miles in a day.
So there's a separate cap trade market for ZEVs.
Yeah, a separate credit market for the vehicle side. Yeah.
And I believe the other 177 states participate in that market as well.
They do, yeah. So it's really like the credits come from the manufacturer for any vehicle sold into California or the other 177 states.
Is there any talk of having other states participate in the LCFS?
Yes. Yeah, I'll get to that. Oregon has one in place, and we're serious about considering connecting the systems and linking the credit trading eventually, maybe. British Columbia has one in place. They're also, in the running for that. Canada's about to adopt one. That's really exciting. Brazil and parts of Europe have similar policies that are being developed or in place already. So it's exciting. I mean, like this, it doesn't work without a global effort, right? I mean, the whole point of this is to solve a global problem. California is providing examples of how to move forward, but not fixing the issue by ourselves. We know that, and that's why everything we do is very focused on how does this translate outside of California? Are people going to buy it and do it outside of this state, where we know that we have, a more progressively minded, excited populace who's willing to try some stuff? So, it's worked in the past, right? I mean, we've done things here first, and then they've gone national. Like the idea of catalytic converters is a good example, right? People didn't used to have them on cars. California said, you got to put them on cars. The manufacturers were like, well, that's a pretty big market. We probably should do it on all of our cars just to make it be easier. And then eventually, came along as a federal requirement. Now they're on every car, right? So, yeah, we're large enough, especially on the vehicle side and the fuel side, because we have so many people driving cars. We're a large enough market that people have to pay attention to us. So, yeah, we're not just demonstrating concept. We're also actually making progress. But
how are you feeling about continuing to get waivers from the US EPA?
It's the challenging question. I mean, they're not going to grant some probably. So the question really is, how do the existing waivers get effective, if at all? Will we be sued, by someone to push our programs forward, then not be able to do that because an existing waiver is pulled or adjusted, or will they do that even preemptively before we attempt to change things? I mean, this review that just happened for the Advanced Clean Car package was basically solidifying things out to 2025, and the Advanced Clean Cars, the vehicle side is really what needs the waivers. The fuel side doesn't. So that's just how the Clean Air Act is structured. And so we've basically locked things into 2025, which hopefully is at the end of the current administration, or no, it doesn't, right? I don't know. So the LCFS does help on the vehicle side, on the EV stuff, because the credits, as I said, for the residential charging go to the utilities sell them, they raise revenue and return them to customers who buy more EVs. So if any of you guys have EVs, you guys are in PG&E service territory, I believe. You can get $500 as a result of this program for any EVs you buy. Let me quickly touch on hydrogen. I know I'm a little behind time, so I'm going to go a little faster. There are 26 retail hydrogen stations open in the state, and we're shooting for 65 to be open, I believe, by 2020 or so. Here's the map that doesn't show you guys, but it doesn't cut you off necessarily. But there was there's nothing. So we were talking about that earlier. We know these are the retail stations. There's this cluster model, right? It's like we're trying to get enough stations for the first few customers to really feel comfortable using these cars, right? And that means the stations are going to be deployed in the Bay Area and in the LA area for the near future. We already talked a little bit about transit agencies. They're making progress. We got electric buses in the state. We got hydrogen buses in the state. We have a ton of CNG buses that are getting credit for the renewable natural gas they're using. And there's also expansion of electric rail or replacement of existing diesel rail with electric rail that's receiving credits from the system. Oh, sorry. California biofuel production is getting dramatically cleaner, partially because they know that there's so much attention paid to what they're doing since they're in state. The Biodeco West Side biodiesel facility is 100% renewable powered. I think that's the first facility in the world that's been 100% renewable powered. All of their process energy, all their inputs to their process is zero carbon. So it's a combination of biogas, combined heat and power process, and these solar trough things for extra process heat. Calgren and others are using biogas as a process fuel. So this is when we say we can see the LCFS driving investment, like these examples we're talking about, because that doesn't benefit you under the federal RFS system, but it does under our system.
So are they getting a lower carbon intensity score?
Yeah, they are. So everybody gets their own score, their facility-specific score. They just come to us. They say, I made this change at this facility. I'd like to put forward a new application to get a better score. And then we evaluate it, and we give it if we think it's warranted. Some other interesting trends is that we talked about renewable diesel being a drop-in fuel, right? It can be used at very high blends. Tesoro and other of the large refineries are talking about using existing petroleum process units to make renewable fuel. They're talking about actually dropping in vegetable oils or maybe pyrolysis oils into FCC units or maybe hydrotreating units at some of the in-state refineries. And that would be a big deal in many respects because first, the total value at risk from their facilities when you do that is huge, right? If you do something that disrupts your petroleum refinery for a few days, you lose millions of dollars. So the fact that they're willing to consider this, we think is significant. They're probably going to start at low volumes, but even low volumes through these facilities is huge compared to some of the standalone biodiesel plants, which are like 5 million gallons a year. Those are very small compared to the petroleum facilities. So anyway, we'll see if they do it, but they're at least talking about doing it, making public press announcements, which is an important step forward, we think. I mean, it's nice that someone is buying in a little bit on this. And, cellulosic stuff, that was definitely a big push during the original adoption of the LCFS and the federal RFS. People believed there was going to be widespread standalone cellulosic ethanol plants running things like corn stover. There are very few of those in operation today, but we are seeing more development of what I consider sort of like bolt-on technologies, like the adenic process, which is getting some of the cellulosic material in the kernel converted to ethanol within the existing process using better enzymes and some other things. So that's significant in that it improves the ethanol yield at the existing facilities with just minor process tweaks and is taking advantage of some cellulosic inputs, basically, that are being not used right now or turned into distillers' grains. So.
It's going to be that guy go ahead and ask this question. Now that Prop 64 has been passed, do you think there's going to be a higher amount of hemp-based feedstock available?
I think that's a good question. I mean, I hope so. I don't see there's any reason why you wouldn't want to try and take advantage of, a crop that can grow that quickly. And, if there is something, if you can actually convert that into a liquid fuel effectively, why not, right? I mean, I think it's just going to be a matter of how does that sector evolve and how do people grow, that material, and do they choose to use it to make a biofeedstock or not? So, okay, so just real quick, sorry, I'm having trouble with this thing. People are often concerned about this program driving crop-based fuels. That's not really the case. As I said, first, the total amount of ethanol used in the state has been pretty much flat. People are usually mostly concerned about the corn side of it. But what I want to show here is that what we've seen is the feedstock switching, especially on the biodiesel side, toward residue and waste-derived feedstocks. And those are the ones that are less likely to have big land use impacts. So to the extent that that's the issue people are worried about, or the food versus fuel debate, this program can pretty clearly show that we're moving away from the feedstocks that are of more concern in that area. And that is not so true for the federal RFS yet.
Do you see that as a limit?
Yes, I mean, I think there's probably a limited amount of those feedstocks globally. But it's a question of, are people using that limited amount that's there today effectively, and also how large is that amount? So,
I mean, will it
yeah.
make a big difference overall?
I think it makes a big difference in California, right? I mean, it changes people's incentive structure and what they want to go out and procure. So, I mean, it's additional value added for the feedstocks that should have less of a land use impact. So, I mean, how much does that just shuffle things versus incent, new sources of those feedstocks? That's the question. There's probably someone out there who says, now I can go out and collect that additional oil that previously I couldn't afford to get from that last restaurant over there, right? So,
But at some point, you run out of those.
yes, that's right. But the question is, at what point? And, should we be attempting to use those before everyone is competing for them? Because we're starting to get more toward that perspective. Europe is strongly shifting toward this waste-based and residue-based framework. We're taking it more moderately than that, but our incentives are still such that we are asking for those feedstocks preferentially over others. So, as I'll show in my last few slides, Europe is basically saying no to crop-based biofuels completely moving forward and strongly focusing on waste-derived stuff, potentially with this issue that you're talking about. But that they also include potential forest residues and cellulosic material to the extent those can be brought in eventually. But there's definitely going to be competition for anything that is qualified as a waste by both Europe and California very strongly soon.
By a policy decision, or is it somehow in the price?
It's a policy decision. Yeah, these are good feedstocks. They'll get a better score in our system, or in Europe, it's like they're just two different categories, right? So if you fall into that bucket, you do quite well in Europe.
Have you tried to predict what fraction of our total
Yeah.
motor transportation fuel that you could?
Yes. I mean, we don't believe that we are approaching using anything close to the total supply of waste and residue oils in California, right? When you look across all the policies in the whole world, then you start to get closer, right? But I think that's an important debate. And I don't think there's a great, sort of public database that shows really transparent information about, say, used cooking oil supply or tallow supply. Those are darker commodity markets. They are harder to evaluate. They're not impossible. You can get estimates, but how good are those estimates? All I know is that the big renderers like Darling and others, they're very interested in this program. In fact, they have a joint venture with Valero called Diamond Green Diesel in Louisiana. They're built a huge, 300 million gallon per year renewable diesel facility now, and they're going to feed it tallow and waste oils. So they think there's enough out there. And they're the ones who know. They're the ones who are in those markets. So I'm not super discouraged that for a while at least we can run the system on some of that. So that's not the long-term solution, though. I agree. I mean, it's part of, it'll always be something, but it's not going to do this 80% reduction that we need by 2050, right? That's when you need hydrogen and renewable electricity and other things like that. But despite the fact that we've had some success with keeping this program running in the right direction, globally there's big problems with total investment in advanced biofuel and biochemical stuff, right? So this sector sort of peaked in 2011 and has been going downhill since. 2016 was the lowest year since 2009, I think. And so new capacity and expansion of existing advanced facilities is just not happening right now. And so that's why we really need to double down on our policy framework in order to get the type of additional volume that we need. This is globally. Yeah, so $649 million globally. Financial crisis, for one thing. The fact that people's perception of biofuels has shifted dramatically. This whole the food versus fuel debate, other things. People in the early 2000s to mid 2000s, people thought biofuels were going to be a huge part of the greenhouse gas solution. Now it's much more narrow. People are concerned about what type of feedstocks, how's it all going to fit? Are we really going to, have enough land? Those types of questions are very important. The answer is in the middle. The biofuels aren't destroying the earth or going to save it by themselves. They're going to be an important part of the picture, but it's going to be targeted. It's going to be in applications that you can't easily electrify, right, like planes, right? So anyway, let me get into that part. So how are we going to maybe change this program post-2020? As I said, there's new legislation that requires us to keep going, and we're going to set a target out to 2030 in the near future here. We're going to add jet fuel to the system, probably, because it's a application you can't electrify. And we previously just didn't do it because we were focused on on-road. We knew we would have trouble bringing in the fossil jet part of it, so we left out the biojet. But now the biofuel companies are working closely with a lot of the airlines. The airlines have real sustainability goals. They're a longer-term off-taker that can get a new facility built. So we're really trying to build around that and bring them in. So you're seeing some more interest from those sectors in working together, basically. And we're trying to be supportive of that. Just to evaluate this whole post-2020 question, though, we did build a model called the biofuel supply model. It's available on our website down here for those of the modelers in the building. What it does is it takes feedstock price estimates and process technology, techno-economic data, and converts various feedstocks into various fuels at various prices, and then evaluates the subsidies that are available, including the LCFS credits, and the transport costs from various locations to assess the fuel mix that might be available at various prices. We're using it to try and help plan out 2030. We have a tentative scenario that's around an 18% target for 2030, also very ambitious, but just to sort of show people what that would look like. And we're mostly relying on the same fuels I've been talking about all day. We're not really predicting big technological breakthroughs or big deployment of additional cellulosic facilities or anything like that, because frankly, we did too much of that when this program was first adopted. We were expecting stover-based cellulosic stuff to be everywhere, and it didn't happen. So we feel like we'll be more conservative this time on the technology side, but maybe more ambitious on the availability of feedstocks. But that's debatable for sure. But anyway, we're talking about the volume of fuels really growing again in the diesel substitutes. Renewable diesel and biodiesel we think can be a big contributor even in the 2030 timeframe. We do get a little bit into the cellulosic feedstocks for some of those in the out years, but not very much. So again, if you look on the credit picture, this is the next slide, it's big, right? It's as big as I would expect by 2030. Yeah. I mean, this basically how this model works is we're handed the energy demand across sectors or across vehicle applications. So our advanced clean cars folks told us how many advanced clean cars they think they would get in this scenario. That electricity is equivalent to that fleet penetration. So, yeah.
Off of that, just with the 80% of the 1990 perspective or goal, can liquid fuels occupy any significant percentage
Yeah.
of our transportation energy consumption to get to that 80%?
Yes, it'd be in the aviation space and the heavy-duty vehicle space. And then there has to be some. So a lot of people have done that sort of 2050 look now, and no one has a solution for those sectors so far that doesn't involve liquid biofuels. So that's why the focus for us is on diesel substitutes and jet substitutes primarily. We believe the... Yeah, I mean, we just think that we're treating electricity and hydrogen as fuels. We think one of those two is the solution in the light-duty side. We credit them in the system. They receive a benefit. So assuming that they do what they're supposed to do, there's a little additional incentive from this program. It's counted. It should happen, right? So this program is very pro-electricity, right? Like the federal RFS is just starting to get there. Like, oh, maybe we should try and find a way to credit electricity. But we've been crediting it from the beginning. We're very, the agency as a whole, we're the biggest ZEV supporters that there are globally, probably as far as regulators go. So, yes, we think electricity is great. We think that hydrogen will have some role by then. And, that's still a bit of speculation, but Toyota and others are committed to it. So we hope that they'll get there. Let me talk about how we relate to other regulators outside of California and other policies outside of California. I know I have about 5 minutes left, but I think I can do it in that amount of time. California knows, as I said, that our whole goal is to have these policies spread, right? And so we have all these formal agreements with all these countries and subnational jurisdictions. The most important ones from the fuel side of it are the Pacific Coast Collaborative and our relationship to Canada. We have formal connections with a couple Canadian provinces on the cap and trade side, so we've gotten to know the Canadians pretty well, and they're starting to move forward with a low carbon fuel standard-like program. But before I go there, let me just quickly touch on the federal system. So most of you may know that there's a federal RFS that's promoting biofuels in the state. The LCFS is on top of that program, right? You can get credits for both the RFS program and the LCFS program for the same volume of fuel. But these are the credits for the ethanol RINs recently. They've lost more than half their value. There's been a rebound, but this was because the Trump administration basically sort of didn't solidify or finalize the last set of targets for ethanol from the Obama administration. And then they just delayed it. Eventually they did it. But that created enough uncertainty that the prices really lost a lot in that time period. That plus the biodiesel tax credit expired in 2016. That will probably be part of the whole tax discussion that will come up. So, there's some pretty significant uncertainty at the federal level right now. I wouldn't say it's as bad as in, say, the vehicle space, or now the clean power plan's completely gone. So, that's worse. But this doesn't help us. I mean, our program is reliant on high incentives at the federal level too. We've always taken advantage of those because everybody who sells a low carbon fuel into California that's a liquid fuel gets both credits and the tax credits in the past, right? So anyway, the Pacific Coast Collaborative, as I said, it's pretty critical. We have worked closely with British Columbia and Oregon so that they have policies that are not very different from ours. Could we link with them? Yes, eventually maybe, not tomorrow, but Oregon's is relatively new, and British Columbia still has some differences in accounting that make it more challenging to say that theirs is ready to be aligned with us. Plus, they don't have an electronic credit system yet, so the ownership of the credits is much more nebulous than in our program, so we're a little worried about that part of it. But we are interested in these formal connections. Our partnership is very strong. We talk on a bi-monthly basis pretty much and compare notes and ask, what fuels are you getting? How are you getting them, right? How are people serving the West Coast market generally? We wish we could talk to Washington more, but we have a pretty good collaboration with them on other issues, but they've gone away from the LCFS-like policy because of a poison pill that was inserted into their transportation package, partially at the behest of the oil companies probably. So they weren't quite able to get there. They did propose one in legislation, and then they got shut down a little bit. But this is the strongest set of counterparties that I talk to in the regulatory space. I also do talk to the EU folks a decent amount, and they are the other big demand center in the world for advanced fuels right now. They have done some interesting stuff with their system, though. They started out in 2009 with a directive that is called the Renewable Energy Directive. It's trying to get 10% of the energy in transportation from biosources or from renewable sources by 2020. And then on top of that, the Fuel Quality Directive said, oh, by the way, transportation fuels are also supposed to achieve a 6% decline in carbon intensity or in greenhouse gas emissions over that same time period. So those two things were put in place, pretty ambitious, but they didn't address some of these land use change issues and other things that we feel like we were more pioneers on. And then they came back in 2015 and tried to look at that issue, and they said, yeah, this looks like a big problem. We think we should move away from crop-based fuels. That was basically the conclusion. I mean, that's a little bit of an overstatement, but they, as part of this directive in 2015, they said, we're going to cap the total amount of food-based biofuels out of the 10% at 7%, and then introduce a new target specifically for advanced fuels that was kind of weak, but it started at 0.05. So then most recently, they went even further. And this is just a proposal. It's not finalized yet. But in November 2016, they said, all right, forget that 7% cap on conventional crop-based biofuels. We're going for 3.8. And these other low-emission fuels are going to now include electricity and stuff like that. And now that needs to be 6.8% by 2030. So anyway, I mean, it's a shift, right? It's a shift away from crop-based fuels because of the issues that people have about food-based competition and total land impacts from these fuels. And those are real issues. I mean, and those are things that California helped pioneer as important things to talk about. But it's a strong shift. It's even stronger than we are on some of this, in that they are explicitly saying, I don't care how efficient you make your process when you make the ethanol. If you're getting it from corn, I don't want any of it. So that's, a hard sell in the Midwest. Like, they're not very thrilled about that. So Germany, within the EU system, has a system that's much more similar to the LCFS. It's carbon intensity based rather than focusing on total energy content. And their targets are 6% by 2020, similar to the Fuel Quality Directive, but they express it all much more closely to how we do. As I said, Canada is developing their own system. They're targeting roughly a 10 to 15% reduction by 2030. And that discussion is really interesting in Canada to me right now. I know I'm almost out of time, but they're talking about it in a way that the scope is broader than just transportation fuels too. So they're talking about including potentially home heating and industrial uses of energy. So it's like almost the entire economy in a intensity-based life cycle accounting program potentially. So I'm not sure if that's good or bad yet. It seems like it's a big thing to try and get your arms around, and they also have a separate push on carbon pricing systems like cap and trade and carbon taxes as well. So you have a lot of competing ideas going on right now. But I'm very excited about the transportation fuels part of this because it gives us another very credible set of other regulators to speak to about how to do the scoring and how to set policy and basically trying to ensure that we're creating a level playing field or consistently incenting the same low carbon fuels to the extent we can. So the last thing is Brazil. They just announced a new policy that they're going to work on called Renova Bio. I'm going to have a terrible Portuguese accent, but they're going to do life cycle scoring as well, and they're going to do some sort of declining carbon intensity standard. That's all I know right now, but this is still very preliminary. They just have recently begun to talk about this. So that would eliminate one of the biggest criticisms that people have levied against the LCFS for a long time, or the conceptual criticisms. It hasn't actually happened. The idea that U.S. ethanol could go to Brazil, corn ethanol could go down to Brazil, and a lot of sugarcane could come into California because it receives a very good score. If Brazil has a similar policy, that won't happen, right? So we hope they put something in place that's similar in framework to ours. So that's all I have. Thanks a lot for everyone's attention, and if you guys want more information, go to our website here. Any other questions or anything? Okay, thanks.